The rolling hills of Wyoming Territory concealed tragedies that most settlers would never witness. But what rancher Thomas McKenzie heard echoing through the canyon on that mournful autumn evening in 1889 would challenge everything he believed about grief and healing. A Shoshone woman's haunting lament for her fallen husband drifted across the wind, a sound so raw with sorrow that it pierced the very soul of any who heard it. What Thomas chose to do in response, abandoning his evening chores to offer comfort through the universal language of music, would set in motion events that would bring an entire Shoshone band to recognize him as family. His spontaneous act of musical compassion would prove that some bonds transcend language, race, and the bitter divisions that territorial conflict had carved between peoples. Chapter 1. Songs of Sorrow. The Wyoming Territory autumn of 1889 painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson as Thomas McKenzie completed his evening chores with the methodical precision that frontier survival demanded. At 38, he had carved out a modest existence from the unforgiving wilderness. His small ranch nestled in a valley where Willow Creek wound its way between towering sandstone cliffs. The isolation that protected him from territorial conflicts also meant that human voices were rare visitors to his remote homestead. Thomas was securing his barn door when an otherworldly sound drifted across the evening stillness. A woman's voice rising and falling in patterns that spoke of grief so profound it seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The haunting melody echoed off the canyon walls, transforming the familiar landscape into something sacred and sorrowful. He recognized the cadence as Native American, though the specific tribal origins remained mysterious to his untrained ear. The lament continued as twilight deepened into true darkness, each note carrying raw emotion that transcended the barriers of language and culture. Thomas found himself drawn toward the sound despite the frontier wisdom that counseled caution around unfamiliar tribal activity. Something in the woman's voice spoke of loss so devastating that it demanded acknowledgement from any soul capable of recognizing genuine human suffering. Following the haunting melody through the gathering darkness, Thomas discovered its source in a narrow canyon that opened onto a hidden valley he had never explored. Concealed behind a screen of cottonwood trees, he observed a solitary figure silhouetted against a small fire. A Shoshone woman sat beside what appeared to be a fresh grave, her voice rising skyward in the ancient songs her people used to guide departed spirits toward their final rest. Thomas retreated to his cabin with the woman's lament echoing in his memory, her grief awakening emotions he had buried since his own wife's death 3 years earlier. The universal nature of loss transcended racial boundaries, creating connections between souls that frontier hatred could never completely sever. Without conscious decision, he retrieved his violin from its resting place above the fireplace. The instrument had been his father's, carried west from Pennsylvania during the family's migration to Wyoming Territory. Thomas had learned to play as a child, finding solace in music during the long winter months when isolation pressed against the soul like a physical weight. Now, standing on his porch beneath the star-filled sky, he began playing a gentle melody that spoke of sympathy and shared understanding. His violin's voice joined the night wind, carrying across the valley toward the canyon where the Shoshone woman continued her vigil, creating an unlikely duet between strangers united by the timeless language of grief and music. Chapter 2. The Healing Power of Music. The following evening found Thomas once again drawn to his porch as darkness settled over the Wyoming Valley, his violin cradled in weathered hands that had grown accustomed to the instrument's familiar weight. The Shoshone woman's lament had resumed at sunset, her voice carrying the same heartbroken intensity that had pierced his soul the previous night. This time, however, Thomas noticed subtle changes in her morning song, pauses where none had existed before, moments of silence that seemed to acknowledge his musical presence across the canyon. Thomas began playing with greater confidence, allowing his melodies to weave between the woman's ancient chants and patterns that created an unlikely harmony between two grieving souls. His repertoire included hymns learned in childhood churches, folk ballads inherited from his Pennsylvania heritage, and original compositions born from his own experiences with loss and loneliness. Each piece seemed to find its place within the Shoshone woman's ritual, creating musical conversations that transcended the limitations of spoken language. As the nights progressed, Thomas discovered that his evening performances had become essential to his own healing process. The widow's courageous expression of grief reminded him of emotions he had buried since his wife Martha's death, feelings too painful to confront in isolation, but somehow bearable when shared through the universal medium of music. The violin's voice became his own, carrying sorrows that words could never adequately express across the darkness, towards someone who understood the weight of profound loss. The woman's mourning period followed traditional Shoshone customs that demanded specific rituals to ensure her husband's spirit found proper rest in the afterlife. Thomas began recognizing patterns in her nightly ceremonies, the timing of her songs, the repetition of certain melodic phrases, and the gradual evolution from raw grief toward acceptance and spiritual release. His musical responses adapted accordingly, offering gentle accompaniment during her most intense periods of sorrow and more uplifting melodies as her healing journey progressed. By the end of the second week, Thomas realized that their nightly musical exchanges had established a routine that both participants depended upon for emotional stability. The Shoshone woman's voice would rise at sunset, calling across the valley with expectations that had grown to include his violin's answering presence. Their musical dialogue had evolved into something approaching a formal ceremony, each evening's performance building upon the foundation established by previous nights of shared artistic expression. Thomas found himself spending daylight hours preparing for these evening concerts, selecting pieces that might offer comfort or practicing new melodies that could contribute to the ongoing conversation between cultures. His isolation no longer felt like punishment, but rather like preparation for a sacred duty that connected him to something larger than his own solitary existence. The music had become a bridge spanning the chasm between two worlds, proving that human compassion could find expression even across the most formidable barriers. Chapter 3. Watching from the Shadows. Hidden among the ancient pines that crown the ridgeline above Willow Creek, 3 Shoshone warriors maintained their silent vigil as they had for the past 10 nights, their eyes fixed upon the distant figure of the white rancher who played his violin beneath the Wyoming stars. Black Hawk, the deceased warrior's brother, gripped his rifle with hands that trembled from suppressed emotion rather than cold, struggling to understand why this stranger continued offering musical comfort to his grieving sister-in-law. The warriors had initially approached Thomas's evening concerts with deep suspicion, interpreting his presence as potential surveillance or mockery of sacred mourning rituals. Shoshone law demanded protection of widows during their vulnerable grief period, making any white man's interest in their ceremonies a matter requiring immediate investigation. Yet night after night, they observed Thomas maintaining a respectful distance while his violin provided gentle accompaniment to Morning Star's traditional laments. Gray Wolf, the eldest of the 3 observers, possessed wisdom earned through 60 winters of navigating the treacherous politics of territorial survival. His weathered eyes recognized genuine compassion when he witnessed it, distinguishing between the calculating behavior of men with ulterior motives and the spontaneous kindness that Thomas displayed through his musical offerings. The old warrior had observed many white settlers during his lifetime, but none had ever demonstrated such sustained empathy toward Shoshone suffering. Morning Star herself had become aware of her hidden audience weeks earlier. Both the protective warriors watching from the ridgeline and the mysterious musician whose violin spoke to her grief with surprising understanding. The combination of tribal guardianship and unexpected compassion from a cultural enemy created a complex emotional landscape that challenged everything Shoshone tradition had taught her about white settlers and their motivations. The warriors' nightly reports to Chief White Eagle revealed details that gradually shifted tribal opinion regarding the strange rancher's behavior. Thomas's consistent respect for proper distance, his careful selection of melodies that complemented rather than competed with sacred songs, and most importantly, his obvious emotional investment in Morning Star's healing journey suggested motivations that transcended mere curiosity or entertainment. Young Spotted Horse, the third observer, had grown increasingly frustrated with their passive surveillance, advocating for direct confrontation that would either expose hostile intentions or establish clear boundaries regarding acceptable interaction with tribal mourning customs. His warrior instincts demanded action rather than continued observation. Yet Gray Wolf's counsel urged patience while they gathered a complete understanding of the rancher's true character. The breakthrough in tribal perception came during Thomas's performance of a haunting melody that perfectly matched the rhythm and emotional tenor of Morning Star's most sacred lament for the deceased. The synchronization seemed too precise for coincidence, suggesting either supernatural guidance or musical sensitivity that bordered on spiritual insight. Gray Wolf recognized this moment as evidence that the Great Spirit might be working through the unlikely medium of a white rancher's violin to facilitate healing that purely Shoshone methods have been unable to achieve. As the third week of their surveillance concluded, the three warriors faced a decision that would determine not only Thomas's fate, but the future relationship between their band and the isolated rancher whose music had become an integral part of their sister's recovery. Chapter 4. The Invitation Extended. Chief White Eagle's council lodge filled with pipe smoke and the weight of unprecedented decision-making as tribal elders gathered to discuss the white rancher whose violin had become an integral part of Morning Star's healing ceremony. The chief's weathered face bore the gravity of someone who understood that their choice regarding Thomas McKenzie would establish precedents affecting Shoshone relationships with settlers throughout the Wyoming Territory for generations to come. Gray Wolf presented his detailed observations with the precision of a scout reporting enemy positions. Yet his words carried respect rather than suspicion as he described Thomas's nightly vigils. The old warrior emphasized the rancher's consistent demonstration of cultural sensitivity, his careful maintenance of appropriate distance, and most significantly, his genuine emotional investment in Morning Star's recovery process. These behaviors suggested a character that transcended the usual settler motivations of land acquisition or commercial advantage. Medicine Man Singing Waters added a spiritual dimension to the discussion through revelations received during sacred ceremonies conducted while Thomas played his evening concerts. The Holy Man reported visions showing the rancher's music creating pathways between worlds, facilitating communication between Morning Star's grieving spirit and her deceased husband's soul in ways that purely traditional methods had struggled to achieve. Such supernatural endorsement carried enormous weight within tribal decision-making processes. Morning Star herself requested permission to address the council, breaking mourning protocols that normally prevented widows from participating in political discussions during their prescribed grief period. Her testimony proved decisive as she described how Thomas's musical offerings had provided comfort that enabled her to complete necessary spiritual work for her husband's proper passage to the afterlife. Without the rancher's unknowing assistance, she explained, her grief might have prevented the ceremonial requirements that ensured eternal peace for the departed warrior spirit. The council's unanimous decision reflected both practical wisdom and spiritual guidance as Chief White Eagle announced their intention to formally invite Thomas into Morning Star's mourning ceremony. Such inclusion represented unprecedented acceptance of a white participant in sacred Shoshone rituals, requiring careful preparation to ensure proper respect for tribal customs, while acknowledging the rancher's extraordinary contribution to their sister's healing journey. Black Hawk, despite his initial hostility toward the mysterious musician, volunteered to serve as the ceremonial messenger who would extend the invitation according to traditional protocols. His offer demonstrated the profound shift in tribal perception that Thomas's consistent compassion had achieved, transforming suspicion into recognition and acceptance. The deceased warrior's brother understood that his slain relative's spirit had somehow guided events toward this moment of unprecedented cultural bridge building. As dawn approached over the Wyoming landscape, Chief White Eagle prepared the formal invitation that would either cement Thomas's place as an honored friend of the Shoshone people or reveal whether his musical ministry represented genuine caring or mere performance designed to achieve hidden objectives. Chapter 5. Sacred Recognition. Black Hawk approached Thomas's cabin at dawn with ceremonial precision, his movements calculated to demonstrate respect while maintaining the dignity that Shoshone protocol demanded during formal diplomatic missions. The warrior carried sacred objects that would formalize the tribe's invitation. Eagle feathers arranged in specific patterns, turquoise stones blessed by singing waters, and most significantly, a medicine bundle containing items that represented adoption into the Shoshone family structure. Thomas emerged from his morning chores to find the imposing figure waiting beside his porch, understanding immediately that this encounter carried profound significance beyond normal frontier interactions. Black Hawk's ceremonial dress, the sacred objects he displayed, and most importantly, his respectful demeanor towards someone he had previously viewed with suspicion, indicated purposes that transcended typical territorial negotiations between cultures. The warriors' carefully rehearsed English revealed the tribe's unanimous decision to include Thomas in Morning Star's final morning ceremony, an honor never before extended to any white settler throughout Shoshone history. Black Hawk explained that Thomas's musical contributions had fulfilled spiritual requirements that tribal tradition considered essential for proper completion of grieving rituals, making his continued participation necessary for Morning Star's successful transition from widow to healed community member. The invitation carried obligations that extended far beyond simple attendance at ceremonial proceedings. Thomas would undergo purification rituals that prepared participants for sacred activities, learn traditional songs that complemented his violin performances, and most significantly, accept spiritual bonds with the deceased warrior's family that Shoshone law considered permanent and binding. Such adoption created responsibilities for mutual protection and support that would influence Thomas's remaining years on the frontier. Singing Waters arrived as Black Hawk completed his formal presentation, the medicine man's presence indicating the supernatural endorsement that supported this unprecedented cultural bridge building. The holy man's weathered hands traced symbols in the dusty earth as he explained how Thomas's musical sensitivity had demonstrated spiritual gifts that Shoshone tradition recognized regardless of racial background or cultural origin. The purification ceremony began immediately, conducted according to ancient protocols that prepared Thomas for participation in sacred activities that few white men had ever witnessed. Sweet grass, smoke carried prayers skyward, while traditional songs established spiritual protection around the rancher, who had unknowingly fulfilled prophecies about healing coming through unexpected sources. Each ritual element reinforced Thomas's transformation from isolated settler to recognized member of the Shoshone spiritual community. Thomas's violin would play a central role in the final ceremony, its voice joining traditional instruments in musical arrangements that had evolved through generations of tribal practice. Singing Waters provided specific instruction regarding appropriate melodies and timing, ensuring that Thomas's contributions enhanced rather than disrupted the sacred atmosphere that such ceremonies required for successful completion. As the purification process concluded, Thomas realized that his simple response to a grieving woman's lament had triggered spiritual obligations that would reshape not only his own identity, but the entire relationship between his isolated existence and the Shoshone people who had chosen to recognize him as family. The music that began as spontaneous compassion had become the foundation for cultural understanding that territorial conflict had declared impossible. Chapter 6. Bonds Beyond Blood. The adoption ceremony that transformed Thomas McKenzie from an isolated Wyoming rancher to honored brother of the Shoshone people unfolded beneath a canopy of autumn stars as tribal members gathered in a sacred circle around Morning Star's completed morning site. Singing Waters led the ancient rituals with ceremonial precision, marking Thomas's face with traditional symbols that would identify him permanently as someone under tribal protection and bound by the sacred obligations of kinship. Chief White Eagle presented Thomas with gifts that carried profound meaning within Shoshone society. A war shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that told stories of courage and honor, ceremonial weapons that marked him as a recognized defender of the tribe, and, most precious of all, a sacred flute carved from eagle bone that would allow him to participate in future spiritual ceremonies. These items represented wealth beyond territorial understanding. Their value measured not in currency, but in the spiritual connections they fostered between cultures. Thomas's violin joined the traditional instruments in a final musical tribute to Morning Star's deceased husband, creating harmonies that seemed to bridge the gap between earthly grief and spiritual acceptance. The ceremony concluded with songs that celebrated not only the warrior's successful journey to the afterlife, but also the unexpected bonds that had emerged from tragedy, proving that healing could manifest through the most unlikely partnerships between former enemies. Within months, Thomas's transformation attracted attention from territorial authorities seeking peaceful solutions to the conflicts that had plagued Wyoming for decades. His ability to communicate Shoshone concerns while maintaining credibility within settler communities made him invaluable for preventing misunderstandings that typically escalated into violence. Federal officials recognized that his unique position could establish precedents for cooperation that military force alone had failed to achieve. Thomas's ranch became neutral ground, where Shoshone families conducted trade with territorial merchants under the protection that both cultures respected. His musical gifts continued serving diplomatic purposes as evening concerts brought together people who had previously viewed each other only as enemies, creating opportunities for understanding that transformed suspicion into mutual respect. The bridge between worlds that began with spontaneous musical compassion established lasting peace throughout the region, demonstrating that individual acts of kindness could reshape entire political landscapes when supported by genuine cultural sensitivity and sustained commitment to healing rather than conquest. This incredible tale of music conquering division shows how compassion can unite the most divided hearts. If Thomas's story of healing through harmony moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more frontier legends that prove love truly conquers all. Share your thoughts about the power of music to heal below.